Hi my quilting friends, Jen here, and in today's video we're diving into my latest quilt pattern, the Pamela Mae Quilt. At first glance you might be thinking, how on earth am I going to make this? Trust me, I thought the same thing when I first sketched out this design. But don't worry, I've simplified the process to make it much easier than it looks. But before we dive into those techniques with all the tips and tricks, let me share the story behind this pattern with you. I started drawing out this quilt this summer during a trip to the Bay Area in California for the Pacific International Quilt Festival. As many of you know, my mom Pam is my travel buddy and booth assistant on these trips. On the drive there, she mentioned that she wished her middle name was spelled M-A-E instead of like the month M-A-Y, because as she put it, it's so much cuter. Well, I can't legally change her name for her. I thought, well, why not name a quilt after her and spell it the way she likes? And that's how the Pamela Mae Quilt was born. Now, one of my favorite things about quilting is how different fabrics can completely transform the look of a quilt. And to showcase the versatility of this pattern, I have made up two versions for you. Version 1 here behind me is made with prints, and it's made in Tula Pink's Tabby Road Deja Vu fabric. I used all 8 prints from the collection, and because these prints are so bold, I added some solids just to give the eye a place to rest. And just look at how adorable these prints are. Of course, there's these cats. The cats, which are the star. I've got tuna cans with little fish bones, hiding mice and puffballs. I had such a blast quilting this version too because I used the fabric designs for inspiration. For example, I took the labels from the tuna cans and stitched them into my square blocks. On solid fabrics, quilting really pops, but it can be harder to see on the prints. So I used Magnifico, which is a thread from Superior Threads, to add a shine that really helps the quilting stand out beautifully, even on the prints. Now, here's a little peek of how it turned out on the back. Isn't that so fun? Okay, the second version of this quilt is made entirely with solids, giving a sleek, modern vibe. And then, of course, I went with simple, straight-lined, quarter-inch quilting. Now, I want you to have fun experimenting with fabrics too. So I've created a free coloring page available on my blog with, of course, the link below. And you'll find the first page with the quilt shapes just outlined for you so you can fill in. But as a bonus, I've included 2 color by number sheets. One for a 6 fabric version like this quilt, and another for a 16 fabric version like this Tula Pink quilt. Now, let's get down and talk construction. We're going to start with straightforward square blocks and these half square blocks along the top. But I know what you're curious about is the curves. And I've used 2 different methods for handling the curves in this quilt. So let me break them down for you. Let's begin with the circle in a circle design, or as I like to call it, the cat in the crescent. We start making the cat in the crescent by getting our 2 fabrics, and then in all of my patterns I always include paper templates, and so this one I print out onto freezer paper, and freezer paper is a product that you can get at the grocery store. One side's paper, one side's plastic. Now you can see I've used this one quite a few times, but I print this onto the paper side and then cut it out. Now the nice thing about freezer paper is it is reusable. So even though I've used this template before, I'm going to go ahead and use it again. And you can get, this is a heavier duty cardstock style version. It just makes a sturdier template, and I have this on my website. So we're going to start by ironing this onto our dark solid fabric here. And when you're using the thicker cardstock, you do have to iron it for a little bit longer. And my iron is dry. Don't want any steam on this step. Now that this is good and stuck, I'm going to go ahead and cut off this edge, and this part doesn't have to be precise, so you can see it's not perfectly matching the edges. That's totally fine. And then I'm going to cut a small hole in the middle here so that I can get my scissors in, and then I'm going to start clipping all the way around to create tabs. And I'm being careful not to let the tips of my scissors get too close to the freezer paper. I'm intentionally leaving them about 1/8 of an inch away, because if I were to cut through
like this, that would ruin my freezer paper and my fabric, and I'd have to start over. So it's easier just to prevent. And I'm going to keep going all the way around. Now I'm going to be using the edge of my freezer paper to pull my fabric tabs up against to create a nice smooth curve. And I am going to use a little bit of Best Press, which is a spray starch and sizing, so it will relax my fabric. And then I'm going to iron these back, pulling them up against that curve of my freezer paper. And I've left my tabs long enough that I can really hold on to them so I don't burn my fingers. Now you could also use an easy press pen for this step and just come along and put a little bit of that formula along the edges here just to get this fabric to come back. Starch works too. Now I've been really picky to make sure I'm getting a nice smooth curve. Once I'm happy with how this looks, then I'm going to peel my freezer paper off, and then I can use that template again later. Now comes the fun part. We are going to fill up this window we've made with our cats. I am going to line up the short edge of my green fabric here. I want at the top, so I'm going to orient that so that it looks good. And I'm going to get all those tabs to lay flat. And the nice thing is now I can be really picky and I can fussy fill up my window here. Get it just nice and straight. Okay, I think that looks really cute. Maybe I'll pull it down a smidge so we get a little more feet in there. Yeah. Now I'm going to take Elmer's school glue, just plain old Elmer's school glue, which is the washable kind, the white stuff. And I don't like big globs of glue on my project, so I put these fine tips on my bottle. They're called fine line glue tips, and I've got these in the shops. There's a link below. And the nice thing about these is they'll create a fine little bead, so I'm not just getting big blobs of glue everywhere. And so then I'm going to come underneath the green fabric and put a little bead of glue all the way around. And the nice thing about Elmer's is that while it's still wet, you can still adjust it if I needed to. But once I have it where I like it, then I'm just going to take my iron and I'm going to iron these together. And that's going to dry out the glue, making these stick together. And I want them to be really stuck all the way around because that's going to make my stitching a whole lot easier. So let's go ahead and give this a press. Really let this glue dry out. And then I like to check and make sure. So you can see, look, I pull on it and it is stuck. So I'm going to just come all the way around, make sure I didn't miss any spots. Oh, right there. There's a little gap. I want this really well stuck. All right, the rest looks pretty good. Let's just give that a quick press again. Now I am going to just roughly trim this off so I am not dealing with this giant piece of fabric here. And it's okay if I clip my tabs some too. I only needed them long so I didn't burn my fingers before. Perfect. So let's work with just this piece. And don't worry, we'll trim the rest off later. This doesn't have to be perfect. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I think this is where the real magic happens. A lot of times when we think about applique or reverse applique, we think about stitching along the surface, along the top, and that creates visible stitching. I prefer the stitching to not be visible. So the trick here is just to peek underneath, and I'm going to go around and stitch directly in that fold that we created with our freezer paper. Now that we're over at the sewing machine, there's a few things I want you to notice. I'm using a coordinating thread that matches this green fabric. I'm using an open toe foot because it makes it easier to see where I'm going. And I've bumped my stitch length down to a 1.8 because smaller stitches make smoother curves. Then I'm just going to peek underneath here, and we're going to go around stitching directly in the fold. And I'm going to take my time and go slow. There's no need to rush with this. I also stitch with my needle with it pausing in the down position, so as I need to, I can always lift my foot, readjust my fabrics, and continue on. If you're working with a fabric that makes it really hard to see the fold, you could always come in, since my fabric's dark, I could use a white chalk pencil and I could trace that stitching line or that fold line beforehand just to make it a little easier to see. I'm seeing okay here. So hopefully you can see that on the camera too. And I'm just going to stitch nice and slow all the way around. Easy peasy. Here's what my my little piece looks like now that I've stitched it. And these little folds right here are not actually like creases, like stitched in puckers. What happens is sometimes the fabric will fold a little bit as it goes under the foot, and the pressure of the pressure foot just creates a little crease. Those are no big deal. But first, I want to go around and trim off all this extra fabric, just like I told you we would do. And I usually trim this in my scrap bowl so that I'm not getting fabric everywhere. So I'm going to come around here and just roughly trim this seam off down to 1/4 inch so that I'm not having a ton of fabric everywhere. Now I'm going to spray this, and like I said earlier, best press is sizing and starch in one, so the sizing will help relax all those little what look like folds that came from the presser foot. And then we're just gonna get this nice and flat. Now you're probably wondering, Jen, how the heck is that grain fabric going to turn into a crescent? Well, guess what? We're going to do this same exact technique with what I call the manta ray, or a clam shell, the piece of fabric, which I use the cat eye fabric, that will go around this piece. There's another template, so I'm going to iron this, the next template, onto the cat eye fabric, create the hole, and fill up the hole with this. And I'm going to put it here at the top so that the crescent forms. The next template has a larger hole. Now that we've covered how to put our little cats in their windows, in their crescents, we also need to talk about the technique I've used to do these great big sweeping curves. So let's do that next. When we do big curves, we need to first of all cut them out. And in the pattern, I do have templates. So this template is for the solid piece of fabric, and then I've got another template here. And I would fold the fabric in half, and I like to take my glue pen. This is a Sew Line glue pen, and it washes out, so I can just tack these templates onto my folded fabric, and then I can either trace them and cut them out, or if I've got it tacked on really well, I could cut it out with my scissors. I don't really recommend using a rotary cutter with paper templates because I don't want anybody's fingers cut. Now, if you look really close at this template, you'll see there are some dots, and I use those to mark because that is where these two pieces of fabric are actually going to meet when we sew them. Now, I've cut these out of my fabric. I've marked the dots. Guess what? I'm going to go right back to my glue pen, and I'm going to come along with these fabrics right sides together, and I'm going to glue baste this entire seam between each of those dots, matching just dot to dot, kind of like a pie. I would slice my pie, so I only have to worry about one slice at a time. And I'm going to just glue baste this entire thing. Then when I go back to my sewing machine, it's going to be much easier because that fabric in that seam allowance is going to lay nice and flat because I've stuck it together, and nothing's going to shift, making it easier to sew. And the goal is to keep a really consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance, not scant, not wide. With curves, we want a very accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance so it lays nice and flat when we are done. And just like I showed you before, I bumped my stitch length down. I used a 2 on these because small bites make smoother curves, and then I take my time and I stitch with my needle down so I can lift my foot as I need to. Curves really aren't that scary once you know all the tricks and you do a little bit of glue basting. I really hope you've enjoyed this video about the Pamela Mae quilt, and whether you're making it in prints or in solids, I would love to see it. Send me some pictures. You can get this pattern on my website using the link below, and of course at your local quilt shop. Please like and subscribe this video so I can keep making more for you. Happy quilting!